Welcome to Maestro Productions podcast, where we share stories about arts, education, and social justice movements. In today's episode, we speak with guitarist, composer, and bandleader Pablo Menéndez. Born in Berkeley, California, Pablo went to Havana at age 15 to study music at the National School of Arts, following a historic visit to Cuba by his mother, the celebrated folksinger Barbara Dane. Pablo became an active participant in the musical movements of the time. He witnessed the birth of the Nueva Trova movement and joined the Grupo de Experimentación Sonora del ICAIC, touring Europe with Silvio Rodriguez, Pablo Milanés, Sara Gonzalez, and others. In 1985, he founded the Grupo Mezcla, which incorporates trova, jazz, rock, rumba, reggae, and other global genres such as zouk from Martinique, creating a unique and dynamic sound.
My name is Pablo Menéndez. I was born Paul Menéndez actually because my mom called me Paul after Paul Robeson, a very important artist of the United States, I think groundbreaking and historic figure I was very proud of my name. But in 1966, my mother, singer Barbara Dane, was the first public person from the United States to defy the State Department ban on travel to Cuba. And the Cuban government was inviting her as a singer, and they put her on TV, on the radio, on the front page of the newspapers and newsreels, because they thought that music would be a great way of educating the whole people of Cuba to the fact that the enemy of the Cuban Revolution was not the people of the United States or the music of the United States, but rather the aggressive policies that the U.S. government had trying to invade the country, send in regime change. They've tried every single way for the last 60-something years, and the United States has really just been hysterically against the Cuban Revolution since its beginning. In any case, my mom was there in 1966, around the time I was, had just finished the 9th grade in Berkeley, California, and was a young, long-haired hippie Californian that was actually visiting her in New York. Anyway, I was, wondering whether I would go to high school in Berkeley High or what I was going to do in my future. And my mom called me up from Cuba and said, wait a minute, wait till I get back because I got to tell you about all the things that I'm seeing here. And basically as a mom, she was looking at the fact that young people my age in the United States were being drafted, military obligation to go and invade a country on the other end of the world called Vietnam. People refer to the war in Vietnam. There was never a war because in war, two people have to be attacking each other, and no Vietnamese threw a rock at the United States. But the United States did invade Vietnam to protect to get the raw resources and the labor power to rebuild Japan after the Second World War. But in Cuba, young people were being incorporated and given practically, total freedom to change the world, and young people wanted to change the world. So I thought that changing the world in Cuba and she actually set it up so I could go and study music at a music school. And we really didn't have the resources, the money to go to music schools in the United States. Are very expensive. And so that's what I did the first year I was there, intensive Spanish studies and, finding out about Cuban culture. And I was at the music school where at the music school, there was a lot of influence on classical music training. And at the dance school that I would pass by on my way between, the dormitories and the dining place or between the classrooms and things, I would pass by and see that they were having classes with Afro-Cuban drumming and rumba and all of this exciting stuff that I had not heard about, which worked into my brain in a way that was, hooked up with, I had seen growing up with my mom, who being one of the groundbreaking, white women approaching and learning and really respecting and being respected by the blues community in the United States. And I had, as a young person been interested in rock and roll, But I had seen that rock and roll, the good rock and roll, was based on the blues, mixing that. And at the time, a young singer-songwriter that was always approaching my mother to pitch songs to her and was kind of unknown by the name of Bobby Zimmerman. But he later became, of course, very world known as Bob Dylan. So I kind of, had made the connection of the fact that, I was a big Beatles fan. And the Beatles had been impressed by Bob Dylan to not write like bubblegum pop songs, but actually write something, more substantial. So having rock and roll that had, roots in the blues and roots in, in world music and seeing, having good lyrics and things like that was a formula that I had come to understand even at the short age, the young age of 14. At 14, my favorite bands in the world right then were Paul Butterfield Blues Band and the Chambers Brothers. So I, was kind of like more educated about the how exciting music was coming out of the United States. Whereas around the world, because of the fact that the United States produces like 90% of the product that's out there, and now with the internet, it's even, like more pervasive, all pervasive, people are colonized by this. So they get whatever is the latest style is shoved down their throat basically as this is what's good, and your old-timey local stuff is passé, so why would you want to know about that? Well, Cuba exactly had been in this process of nationalizing things and putting traditional Cuban culture and, contemporary pop music of the time, like, in their rightful place of dignity on TV, on the radio, and all the mass media, which is now Cuban 100% record distribution, all of these things, which is such a unusual situation because any other country in the third world, it's all run by the U.S. You go to a rich country like Mexico. In Mexico, if you go to Mexico City, the biggest cinemas are all like Disney, Pixar, Universal. It's all like U.S. conglomerates run the show. And then Mexican films have to be seen in like a art, cinema at the university or something like that. So it's really an exciting phenomenon that in Cuba, Cuban culture had been put in its rightful place on the mass media of Cuba, which was now owned by Cubans. And, it was this totally different situation. And so I was thinking, at the time, well, if in the United States you take, blues roots and put electricity on it and good lyrics and you get this exciting, really evolved popular music, in Cuba, it turns out that you have a very similar situation because the root music would be rumba, Afro-Cuban music, and son, the first music which was combining the elements of the African diaspora, the dynamic always of the survival culture of people who had been enslaved, and the European culture, the mixture, the biggest mixture of all times of humanity. It's a mixture of different nationalities of Europeans, different nationalities of Africans coming together in the Americas, basically in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the United States. And all of this culture, of course, the African element is the most dynamic part because you think about it, you couldn't bring luggage on a slave ship. And yet everywhere you look in the world right now, there's conga drums, there's all sorts of percussion instruments, there's all sorts of the survival culture. And in Cuba, it's just incredible because the difference between in the United States, where basically the Europeans had been kicked out of Europe and sent to the Americas, find some, make a new life for themselves. And they came here thinking, okay, we're going to be here, forever. So we better just kill off the local people and take this over for ourselves and bring in slaves to do the work. And, but we don't want to, they're Christians, but they're Protestants. And this is a problem because, the Christians coming to the Americas, South America, the Caribbean, Cuba, were Catholics. And so they were conquistadores, right? They weren't sent, away. They were coming here to get gold and stuff and then maybe go back to Spain. The whole attitude about culture and everything else in their lives they could, if they did anything wrong, they could go and confess, so they get absolved. And so, it's just a different situation. So the survival of African culture in its pure forms, incredibly, was possible. I mean, even with all of the different laws that they would pass, because of different historical events, like the Haitian Revolution, which was one of the first revolutions in the Americas, and right after the North American, the 13 colonies revolution, right, 1804. And, following the whole French Revolution and everything in the Americas, the slaves of Haiti had revolted. And it's, I think, one of the only successful slave revolts of history. This scared the shit out of the slave owners. And so they started to pass different laws like, okay, how do we avoid slave revolts? Well, okay, it's illegal to have all of the slaves be from the same nationality. So you have to mix them up and be from different language groups and different nationalities so that they cannot on their, I don't know, slaves didn't have a coffee break, but in their free time, whatever time they had, then they wouldn't be discussing the common topic that, think if you and me were slaves, what would we be talking about was escape, revolt, getting out of this. We don't want to be slaves all our life. So this brought on a situation where, because of the fact that a lot of the different slave populations were brought from nationalities where music was much a part of their religious life, had to do with their polytheist religions of different gods or whatever it was, but they had, it was strongly tied to their particular culture, so it really didn't mix well, the religious music. But like I say, in whatever spare time there was, then there was the possibility to have, what is the common element of any human group, in especially young people would be interested in, having some sort of music and dance and activities that would bring them closer to the objects of their desires. So actually, party music, like let's dance and find a way of approaching the opposite sex or whatever. So in any case, that was the birth of rumba. Now, rumba is not a religious music, but it's a music that will accept anything, any culture, any element that came in. It could be, for example, one of the reasons in the United States they have like the blues scale, and in Cuba and in the countries that were dominated by the Spanish Catholics, they didn't, was because Spain had been, occupied and was part of the Arab world, the Islamic world for many years, until 1492 was the year that the Spanish Catholics were finally able to be victorious against the Moors, the Islamic population. And so then they were very serious about not bringing, when they were going to Western Africa to buy slaves, any slaves that had been related to Islam, and Arab traders, were going down the West Coast and, doing business with all of the different peoples of the Western coast of Africa. So they were, trying to get only slaves that did not have this influence of people whose music, by the way, had these quarter tone, scales that where the blues notes and things would come from. So that's one thing. But then the other thing is that the Protestant church has this way of, having their religious propaganda be in singing songs, which would incorporate all the different age groups and sexes so that they would have very simple 4-part harmonies. So, like vocal quartets and things like that came to be very natural for people in North America. Whereas the Catholic Church always had this thing of imposing Rome. And so you're supposed to do things like this, where you have a brilliant soloist and it's backed up by somebody. So that's, it's a different approach to music. Now, all of these elements come together to have the first music born in Cuba, not brought from Africa or from Europe, is rumba. But also the Spanish troubadours, in tradition started to have also accompaniment that had rhythmic influence from the African diaspora. So all of a sudden you have son and rumba, and the son and is one of the basic ingredients of the whole trova or trovador tradition in Cuba. And people in the Anglo-Saxon world, have become aware of all of this in very relatively recent times through this wonderful project that brought new life to people that we've known and loved forever in Cuba that, were all at retirement age. But they put together this practically by accident, a project that brought together an anthology of old musicians that were doing stuff that got the name of Buena Vista Social Club. Buena Vista Social Club has a lot of this son element, and son and the trova, the troubadour, tradition of these songs, which were, largely influenced by different popular things of the era of the, late 1800s up to the 1900s, right, of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, around the time that Cuba was abolishing slavery and gaining its independence. Another musicology element there is that around the time that that Cuba had been struggling for its independence for around 30 years against Spain, it was one of the last colonies to gain its independence from Spain. The United States was looking southward and, of course, westward too, and had the war with Mexico and just expanding. And looking south, they saw that the rebel forces were 80% black, that most of the generals were also Afro-Cuban, and they were very much afraid, again, of this example of Haiti and a slave revolt and things. So they decided, well, why don't we intervene there? But since there was a seasoned rebel army that had been struggling for 30 years, they couldn't just annex the thing and make it, a state of the United States. So they did recognize a constitution, a government, a flag, and the nationality of Cuba, although it was very much, they imposed a thing called the Platt Amendment that basically gave the United States the right to intervene whenever they saw that they felt like it, and they did a couple of times after they withdrew after the thing. And in fact, the discussions, the end of the war, was a conference held in Paris between Spain and the United States, which didn't include the Cubans. In any case, another interesting element of that was, because everybody in the United States has heard the name of the city of Guantanamo, which rightfully would be one of the most exciting and prosperous and beautiful ports of Cuba, except that it was leased at gunpoint by the United States in perpetuity to be a U.S. Navy base, where, of course, the United States has this horrendous prison where they torture people and hold them for 20, 30 years with no charges. But Guantanamo actually is a city of Cuba, a little bit inland on the bay there. And so thus the song Guantanamera is a song about a young woman from Guantanamo. And that, of course, is something that people around the world heard because it was a big hit song in 1966, which is basically a guajira related to this whole trovador or son tradition. So son, S-O-N, son, and trova, which is, comes from troubadour, is one of the basic ingredients that fuels all of the contemporary stuff that even, if you listen to Cuban hip hop, Cuban rap, Cuban reggaeton, Cuban whatever, new style that there is, jazz, rock and roll, all of this stuff is very heavily influenced by that, because of, again, a kind of a more mature approach to the question of imitating whatever is coming from the metropole, from the United States or Europe or wherever, or being nationalistic about it. Well, if you want to have your own personality, then of course you want to have some of your own national roots. And Cuba has these incredible national roots because of this same dynamic of the process of the mixture of European and African cultures. So going back to me, I was, at the end of the year that I was supposed to be in Cuba, I was, totally involved in all of this stuff without imposing any of my own views. But I was, like, wait a minute, this, I want to be a part of this. I started to be involved in this music thing. And so I was invited to be a part of this band at the Film Institute. Let me backtrack just a minute, because there was a historic event. My mom was not living in Cuba. She was, she left me there at the school. I was a live-in school. I was, living at the school. And, but she came back about 6-7 months later to a historic event that was, I think, inspired by a talk that she and her husband, Irwin Silber, who was editor of a folk music magazine in the United States, the most important folk music magazine, and some of the record distribution of, Sing Out magazine, and the whole folk music world. And they had given a talk at an cultural institution in Cuba called the Casa de las Americas. And I remember the first thing that my mom was telling me when she got back, was she saying about, the America, people in the United States always say, United States is America. And she said, well, actually, one of the things I learned in Cuba is that America is, from the tip of South America, Chile, and Argentina, all the way to the North Pole. It's like a whole, 3 different continents is America. So the United States is the United States, and America is all of the rest of this stuff. So Cuba is part of America, and Latin America, all the Central America, all this is part of America. So Casa de las Americas is the house of the Americas, of all of them. And they gave a talk on what was very, calling the attention, grabbing the attention of people around the world, because people in the United States, a lot of singers of this tradition that was around from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and in the 60s started to become part of the, got the interest of the cultural mainstream in the United States, that they were calling protest songs. So they gave a talk about this protest song thing. And so the Casa de las Americas, a few months later, decided to hold an international world meeting of protest singers. And so for an amazing, something like 3 weeks, brought people from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, from the United States. Actually, they kind of an embarrassing thing for the United States is that they told, since my mother and Irwin Silber had been there, so recently, they said, listen, this is an open invitation, like to anybody from the United States who wants to come, defying the State Department ban on travel. So my mom and Irwin Silber, Barbara Dane and Irwin Silber, sent out 50 invitations to all of the known and, unknown names. 50 people were invited, expenses paid, to come to Cuba for 3 weeks and meet people from around the world that were doing similar types of music. And embarrassingly, none of them dared to come, except for one writer and part-time singer, Julius Lester, but who basically also was part of the event for a while, but then he went on to a different event. And so, basically Barbara Dane was, again, the representative from the United States at the event. And this other young American guy who is her son, who was at school, but she got me some permission to go and sing with her. So I was part of the performing thing there. And again, I had this wonderful newspaper clipping that I found recently of a picture of me, again, because there was an artistic ensemble from the front lines of Vietnam. The Viet Cong, the Liberation Front of South Vietnam, had sent a cultural ensemble that was part of the event. And on stage at one moment, then the Vietnamese made a point of embracing me as a young American, so that publicly they say, no, we're not at war with the United States. And so this, the Cuban newspaper said, only in Cuba could something like this happen. And yeah, it probably was the only place in the world where that might be in the newspapers. And so that was a clipping of me at age, I think I had just finished becoming 15. So I was already a mature young man. Anyway, this thing at the, fast forward to a few months later, Casa Las Americas had been looking around for what are the equivalent in Cuba of the protest song movement. And one of the people that was very central from the Cuban side to the Encuentro de Canción Protesta, this international meeting in 1967, was a traditional musician, troubadour, who is an amazing songwriter, written all sorts of different songs, everything, any current events that was happening in the news, he would write a song about it. And his name is Carlos Puebla. Carlos Puebla is such a great guy, besides that when my mom was visiting Cuba the first time, and she was introduced to him and over at his house and meet him, instead of teaching her one of his songs, he said, no, the song that you really have to learn now, because people all over Cuba will want to hear you singing this, and it's like such a major song, is a song written by Eduardo Saborí, called Cuba, que linda es Cuba. And if you think about it, it's like, having, John Lennon and Paul McCartney teach you a Bob Dylan song, or Bob Dylan teach you a John Lennon and Paul McCartney song, or something like that. It's like, it was, anyway, so my mom learned it. At the time, her repertoire was getting more and more diverse and complicated, because, from the blues and jazz and American folk music and things, now she was adding on music from all over the world, and Cuban trova and Cuban, protest songs. And, Carlos Puebla had written an amazing song also about Che Guevara called Hasta Siempre Comandante. That was, has been a worldwide hit with anybody interested in anything related to Latin America or Cuba, or in general, changing the world for the better. Anyway, Casa Las Americas, a few months after the event was over, was thinking, wow, there has to be young people in Cuba that are doing stuff like that or are influenced by all of this. And so they organized a concert with two people that they were able to find. One of them had his own TV show, which was an amazing thing for this young kid who was breaking all the rules and writing these songs that most people thought were really strange things. And, he is just a songwriting machine. He's like writing songs and songs and songs and songs and songs. And he, at the time, nobody knew that he would become one of the most well-known and prolific singer-songwriters of the whole Spanish-speaking world. But this kid had his own TV show, which I think had ended around that time. And he had met another young singer who was like, singing in the kind of nightclub, late 50s, early 60s version of trova called Feeling, actually, which had a lot of jazz influence and stuff. But he was like also like breaking all of the rules and doing something different. And people thought, wow, this is not exactly like the earlier generation. What is this stuff? And that guy is a young man named Pablo Milanés. And the one that had the TV show is Silvio Rodriguez. So Silvio and Pablo knew each other, and they knew this other guy, a young man named Noel Nicola. Noel Nicola had a couple of songs too. So they got together, but they were thinking, wow, we don't have enough songs to do a whole concert by ourselves at Casa de las Americas. In the audience, there was a couple of other kids. One of them was a bass player, a guitar player, Eduardo Ramos, a blind guitar player, Martin Rojas, and another singer-songwriter, friend of Silvio's called Vicente Feliu. And between all of them, between the three on stage and the ones that they brought up to do stuff, they actually pulled off a concert. And people started to see, wow, there are all these young people here doing protest songs. Now, you have to understand that at the time, the generation that had, fought at the putting their life on the line, the very dangerous and bloody dictatorship of Batista, and had this incredible triumph that the whole people of Cuba were celebrating, and then just millions of people, in the streets, the Cuban Revolution and things. And so they think, well, now we're victorious. So what are you protesting about? We already did everything that, protests would need to talk about. I didn't really understand it. So the name protest song didn't seem to fit. And the young singer-songwriters that were basically singing with a guitar, composing with a guitar, and doing stuff, and also searching for their Cuban roots, in son and trova, stuff like that. They said, well, we're trovadores, So, well, yeah, but this is new stuff. So, okay, well, we're new trovadores. So the name Nueva Trova started to be thrown around. This may be a little bit confusing because this is like 68. So this is 68, right? So, but institutionally, there was really like not a lot of places to perform or how to organize or how to, deal with all of this new phenomenon that really didn't go well with the traditional Cuban things, of, we listen to music while we're dancing. The dance music has always been like, music, it's dance. Like I say, there was people that had a resistance to, they wanted to have Cuban music, very nationalist feelings that were the stuff that was the culturally necessary part of the making a revolution. And, especially a very nationalist revolution 90 miles off the coast of the biggest empire in the world, and the cultural empire especially. So having Cuban music and music in Spanish instead of being like invaded, by rock and roll and music in English from around the world, had the people programming stuff favor even cover versions of rock and roll from, artists singing in Spanish in Mexico or in Spain. And even Italians, singing in Spanish because of course, there's a much bigger market in Spanish than Italian. Basically, there was very little direct influence of rock and roll on the air of Cuban stations, although it's, of course, famous that in the south of the United States, there was very potent AM stations in Little Rock, Arkansas, for example, that were easy to hear on the radio in Cuba. So that was, there was direct influence from what was happening in the rock and roll world. And like I say, people were fascinated with, the Beatles and what was happening around that. And a lot of debate and discussion and conflict around, was this something, because it did seem to the generation that, had been, like I say, putting their life on the line to fight against the bloody Batista dictatorship to make the Cuban Revolution. They thought that, now we're going to have, nationalist music, Cuban music, and only Cuban music. We don't want to have any of this stuff imposed on us from abroad. So, of course, other people with a more mature attitude were saying, well, yeah, but we want to have, dosify this stuff and have all of it available, but basically, not be... and like I say, the most progressive idea at the time was to recreate, using a similar formula, a Cuban equivalent of whatever was happening around the world. But a lot of that, and especially Cuban dance music, like you walk down the streets in Cuba at the times, you'd definitely be listening to the high-pitched wooden flute that was part of the Orquesta Aragon, for example, the bands playing cha-cha-cha and, son, and what later in the United States, because of the fact that they were playing for a diverse, nationally diverse and culturally diverse Latino population, where people were from Puerto Rico or Cuba or Venezuela or Mexico or wherever. And so they started to use, instead of Cuban names like son and trova and cha-cha-cha or something like that, they would say, okay, this is salsa. So the whole concept of salsa is something born of the diverse Latino neighborhoods in the United States, but basically it is based very much like 90% on Cuban son and cha-cha-cha and the different rhythms, dance rhythms coming out of Cuba. And that was what basically you would hear. And these new singer-songwriters that were doing, different types of songs that really didn't fit between the bar stools of a bar or in a nightclub where people were going to get close to the object of their desire, and hearing these political songs in the middle of a dance floor. It's just there's not very many places to play this music or how to deal with it. So basically, a lot of it was going on in people's living rooms and parties, and then there was this, like I say, historic concert put on by the Casa de las Americas in February 1968, where they brought together 3 of the young singer-songwriters that were writing these new types of songs that they said, this comes from the tradition of the Cuban troubadour, the trovador. So it's trova, writing singer-songwriter songs with the guitar and, some Cuban influence and influence from around the world. And so they started to, toy with the different names for it. And basically these, the 3 artists that had been found by Casa de la America and programmed were Silvio Rodriguez, who later became one of the most influential and prolific artists of the whole Spanish-speaking world. His songs are just known around the Spanish-speaking world as like just part of what people have grown up with for the last 50 years. And also singer-songwriter and especially singer Pablo Milanés and Noel Nicola. And when they were doing this concert in February 68, there was 2 or 3 people in the audience, a blind guitarist, Martin Rojas, a bass player, guitar player, Eduardo Ramos, and another friend of Silvio's, Vicente Feliu, who had some songs. So they got up and sang some of their songs too. And, it became obvious that this was not just a few isolated people, but there was actually this whole new movement of singer-songwriters coming up in Cuba. The Film Institute then had this amazing project that had been going on for 7 or 8 years, 9 years, and young filmmakers were starting to make their first films. And a lot of them were using as soundtracks, interestingly enough for me, stuff from where I came from San Francisco psychedelic rock. So they had films about Ho Chi Minh, for example, and what was happening in Vietnam, with music from Iron Butterfly or Led Zeppelin or the Country Joe and the Fish. And the Film Institute was saying, that kind of goes together, but I wonder if we could have some sort of a Cuban equivalent to that. And an amazing, one of the most important composers of the classical guitar, revolutionized the music for classical guitar, and a fundamental composer in the whole classical music arena in the world is composer Leo Brouwer, Cuban Leo Brouwer, and who actually had studied at Juilliard in New York and went back to Cuba at the time of the revolution as part of the musical scene in Cuba. And the Film Institute asked him to get together some young musicians that would be kind of a think tank and try to develop some music that would be the equivalent of what was happening in the new young filmmakers' films. Leo Brouwer, and also on the suggestion by the head of the Casa de las Americas, who had held this concert a couple of years before and knew about these young singer-songwriters, she told her name is Aide Santa Maria, and she was like one of the leaders of the revolutionary movement, around the whole 26th of July movement that made the Cuban Revolution, and was the head of the cultural institution, the Casa de las Americas. And she really had no way of assimilating these people. But when Alfredo Guevara, the head of the Cuban Film Institute, that had also been born with the Cuban Revolution, like trying to develop a national film industry and movement, and had trained and sponsored all of these young filmmakers who were making their first films. And as I say, where they're using soundtracks of music that sounded interesting for them. It was, like Led Zeppelin or Iron Butterfly or Country Joe and the Fish, psychedelic rock from San Francisco. It's interesting, seeing a film about, Cuban agriculture or Ho Chi Minh or, what was happening in Vietnam. Or, there was, of course, then, couldn't we have like a Cuban version of this type of stuff? So the Film Institute decided to sponsor this think tank, basically, and Leo Brouwer was brought in as a music specialist to try to locate people and also to organize a course of teaching all of us musical techniques. And, he had the idea that going to a music school, an academy for 6 or 7 or 8 years or something, he could, with popular musicians, do that in 2 or 3 years and have them reading and writing music and arranging. And he did. And so he brought in some really interesting teachers, very revolutionary teachers. In fact, an American person from the United States, really important composer and teacher called Fred Smith, who had come in via Mexico together with some revolutionary young musicians and artists that had come to Cuba. And he was brought in as a teacher, a person who was doing really revolutionary work in terms of teaching solfeggio, reading and writing music, musician from the National Symphony Orchestra, Juan Elosegui. And anyway, they brought together this think tank, and the head of the Film Institute, so two people that were part of my cover band in the National School of Music a couple of years before were invited by a great writer and jazz musician who was invited to this, Leonardo Acosta. And they knew about me, so they told Leo Brouwer, hey, this is a young American guy who has these very similar ideas, so I'd get him. So they brought me in, and I was the youngest one, a few months younger than this, the piano player Emiliano Salvador and the drummer Leonardo Pimentel. And so we were part of this think tank that the head of the Film Institute had a meeting with us, and he said, listen, you guys are not going to have any production, goals or any obligation to do anything. If a film director, a young film director, wants you to be part of their film, they have to make you fall in love with their project. And then you can do music for it. And here's the studio and all the free studio time. And, you can compose all this music for the film. But it's not obligatory. It's not, you're not forced to do it. It's that they have to, really make you fall in love with their project. So this was, just an incredibly exciting project to be a part of, because we had a studio to record anything, even if it wasn't a finished idea. Very rudimentary studio, let me say. But the whatever was being used around the world at the time was also, there was this whole revolution in the technology around it also just beginning to happen at the time. And we had this possibility of studying, and then also studying and thinking all of the history of Cuban popular music and what was happening in places like Brazil and the Caribbean and Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, not only what was happening in the United States. And then I think my role was also that, having been brought up inside the music of the United States, but, by a blues and jazz singing mother, where I knew beyond the facade of the pop music commercial world, the formula of how getting great music, how that came about and what was it all about, so that we weren't colonized by it. It was, there's a big thing in around the time of decolonizing your mentality. And and feeling related to everybody that was doing that around the world also. A couple of years later, when we were doing music for films that were being seen all over Cuba, people visiting Cuba from around the world were being influenced by the stuff that we were recording, the songs that we were doing. There was a filmmaker from England that came and did a film about what was happening in Cuba, the transformations for young people and things. And he called the film Cuba Va. And he asked, was it possible for Silvio, Pablo, and Noel to write a song together? And they wrote a song, six-handed composition. But basically the song is a rock electric guitar solo from beginning to end with some lyrics in the middle. And the rock electric guitar was me. I was 17, 18 years old at the time, so I didn't think much of that, but I was just doing it, This was just an amazing explosion of popularity with Cuban youth. It was like, oh, wow, listen to this. We got our own rock and roll. This stuff is, it. So we started, we're doing little performing as a performing group. But one of the problems was that any theater we would perform at, people would just storm the door, break down the doors. There was no way that any theater could hold enough people. And there wasn't sound system for doing huge, outdoor concerts at the time. So, it was a contradiction. We didn't do that much live performing. A couple of years into this, the troubadours from all over the country get together and decide to form a movement, an official, organized movement, so that they could find venues and find ways of, being on radio and TV and making records. And, in unity, there is strength, right? So the union makes us strong. So the Nueva Trova was the name that they decided to call this movement. We had sent a couple of representatives. A couple of months before, Silvio had done a theme song for a TV series that was an interesting series because it was like a fictional recreation of what was happening in the revolutionary movement in Uruguay, the Tupamaros and everything. And so it's about, all of the different revolutionary activities of the Tupamaros. And so Silvio wrote a song. At the last minute, he didn't want to sing the song himself. So he wanted to bring in a different singer. And there was a young woman singer-songwriter named Sara Gonzalez. And he brought her to sing. It was a little bit low key for her, but it became immediately a huge hit song. So we had a little debate in the group. And I remember that I was saying to people, the one major defect that this band has, this group and this, whole thing at the Film Institute is that we don't have any women here. And we cannot represent the whole of the Cuban population, young people, if we don't have any women involved in this. So I think we should have, ask Sara Gonzalez to come and be a part of this band. I guess my argument worked. And I started, Sara being very close to my age. And, we were kind of like the youngest part of the band and like the newcomers and most unknown ones. So she would always have me do the arrangements for a lot of the first songs that she did. Around that same year, we did a homage to all of the different Brazilian singer-songwriters that we did. It was a concert half and half. Brazilian music from people like Chico Buarque, Caetano Veloso, Gilberto Gil, a lot of the different composers that were doing similar type of music in what they were calling the Tropicalia movement in Brazil, and that we had been listening to at the same time that we're listening to, rock and roll by very, I would say, developed rock and roll groups like, the Mothers, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, or King Crimson, or Crosby, Stills and Nash. I was trying to get, people like Pablo Milanés had, been very influenced by older quartets like the Platters and things. I said, no, you got to listen to this stuff. They harmonize the vocals a different way, and they're all like lead singers coming together. It's a different concept. And we were listening to a lot of that stuff and a lot of what was happening in Europe and Asia and in Latin America, the parras, the Latin American folk songs, Victor Jara, Daniel Biglietti, all of the people that had been to Canción Protesta and things. But basically, we're also listening to instrumental music, not only songs. I had just visited my mom in New York and gone to the club where I had performed with the idea that maybe I could crash the door and get in for free because I didn't have any American money, U.S. money. So I went there, and I was able to get in to see the second set of guitarists that I'd heard about because he had just played on a record with Miles Davis, a guy from England who is revolutionizing the electric guitar in the world, a guy named John McLaughlin. So I met John McLaughlin in 1971 in New York at the Cafe Agogo, where I'd been playing with my mom a couple of years before. Anyway, so I brought this back, and I was listening to that, and again, it's just like a kind of cultural translation. I was thinking, if he uses the roots of blues, and then we'll use like complex rhythmic forms like 5/4 rhythm or 7/4 or 9/8 or different things that would be different, like revolutionize the music and electric guitar used in a certain way. So, well, instead of using blues, if I was to use son, but doing it with references to Cuban folkloric music, and we're doing all this stuff because our idea was that we were revolutionizing Cuban music in general, all sorts of Cuban music, and opening up new possibilities. Because the same as there was no venues for listening to the singer-songwriters, there was no venues really for listening to jazz and this kind of new rock and roll instrumental, experimental stuff. So when we sent going back to the founding of the Nueva Trova movement and this meeting, we had sent Eduardo Ramos, Sara Gonzalez, and Noel Nicola as like delegates to this meeting. And when they came back, they said, well, okay, is the band going to be part of that? And there was a lot of debate in the band because we were saying, well, the singer-songwriter thing is one part of what we're doing, but it's not all of what we're doing. Maybe we can or maybe we can't. But since it was, like such a big national group of people all over the island, and they felt very related to the singer-songwriters that were in our band because we had Sara Gonzalez, we had Noel Nicola, Silvio Rodriguez, Pablo Milanés, Eduardo Ramos. Basically, those were some of the most influential and popular and important, prolific artists of the what was being called Nueva Trova. So I guess the band was also one of the lines of work that we're doing with Nueva Trova. So Nueva Trova, like I say, there was people all over the islands that felt before this very isolated. Like, wow, I'm doing these songs, and where do we perform them, and how do we, make this stuff be understood that, what we're talking about. And because the songs were talking about all of the new social relations, the transformation of life for women, especially young women, in Cuban traditional patriarch society, it was, very limited. Women were all of a sudden, with the revolution, becoming part of the workforce and studying and on equal footing in all the areas of life, a new role for women. This, had to be spoken about in songs. The love songs were not going to be the old traditional thing of if you leave me, I'll die. And Sara was making some real kick-ass songs at the time, and I was really happy to be part of the. It was a very important movement on the national scale, and starting to influence people around the world because these protest singers from Latin America and Spain, especially, because of the language thing, were definitely feeling very identified. Because we're talking about Cuba right now, but what was happening in the world? Well, Spain was run by a fascist dictator since the 1930s, Franco. And singer-songwriters had to use all sorts of metaphors and symbols and, like all sorts of poetic things. But there was a whole big audience for songs talking about, we don't want fascism in Spain anymore. The same thing was happening in Argentina, for example. They had a fascist dictatorship. And there was stuff happening that, the singer-songwriters of Brazil and Argentina had to live in exile in Chile with Pinochet. Forget it. Like they were thrown in jail or murdered by the fascist dictators, so they had to go someplace else. And in Spain, it just happened that the technology I was talking about, the new technology had invented this little thing. Instead of a vinyl record that's kind of hard to hide when you're walking down the street, now they had these little cassettes. And you could have a little cassette in your pocket with some revolutionary songs from singer-songwriters from Cuba, and go to the university, go to school and play it for your friends. And so all of a sudden, even during Franco, Pablo Milanés and Silvio Rodriguez had become extremely popular, as well as the older singer Carlos Puebla and his songs. And then Franco died and things started to change in Spain. The Spanish singer-songwriters had been limited a lot to kind of agitprop stuff that, you got to sing and run when the police come. And, the band at the Film Institute, Grupo ICAIC, Grupo de Experimentación, Sonora de ICAIC, whatever, the long name, had been invited to a Cuban Culture Week in Bulgaria and in Poland. And so we were going to be in Europe, and to fly back to Cuba, had a stopover in Madrid. And Silvio and Pablo had just been in Spain, and the promoter was basically, driving them around the country in a car with two guitars in the back, in the trunk. And they were doing, everything, huge venues, like, bullfighting rings, like I'm talking about. They were really starting to happen. So somebody had come back and he wanted to do something. He said, well, we want to have Sara Gonzalez and Pablo Milanés. Both of them were singing in the band. And Sara and Pablo said, well, we don't want to do this thing, just two guitars. We'd rather, do all the stuff that we're doing with the band. So in 1976, right on the, the explosion of the joyous cultural revolution that was going on in Spain after all these years of fascism, after the death of Franco, we were invited then to do a whole tour around Spain. And I remember the culmination of this, was a concert in one of the biggest theaters in Madrid. It was totally sold out, and there was about 2,000 people outside wanting to get in. And at the time, since they still had the fascist laws, it was illegal for more than 3 people to be standing on a street corner in Spain. So 2,000 people, of course, then the riot squad came out, and there was an ongoing battle. Inside, we were playing the concert. Outdoors, it was like fire hoses and dogs and clubs and, just police repression. Like, you can't. Spanish audiences at the time, had been so used to the metaphors and the, reading between the lines of the singer-songwriters, so that when we would sing the songs, between the lines and, between songs, the whole audience would be chanting freedom and amnesty for political prisoners, not unnoticed by the big record conglomerates of the world, transnationals that really have no politics. They just want to sell records. And they decided to monopolize the whole thing, so they bought the contracts of Silvio and Pablo Milanés. And they wanted the world to think that that was it, right? They buy our records and not anybody else. So Sara Gonzalez really didn't make it back to perform in Spain for another 20 years. And these conglomerates are so worldwide pervasive at the time that they would sell records by Pablo Milanés and Silvio Rodriguez, even in countries that had dictators like Pinochet. They would just have the records have only the love songs. In countries that were having rebel warfare like El Salvador. So the commercial radio would play the love songs, and the guerrilla radio in the mountains would be playing all the political songs. But, in countries like Mexico and Argentina, after the fall of the dictatorship there, they just became huge, commercially successful. To the point, Silvio Rodriguez played in Buenos Aires. I think he hadn't played there for a number of years, had not done anything to promote his music or, done any commercial. No beer company or cigarette company was promoting him. And the record company even fall off a little bit. But he played in Buenos Aires a few years back for 100,000 people on a free concert outdoors. they had to change the schedule of the soccer tournament that was going on. And in Argentina, that's like religion. And in even more recent times, during the pandemic, I think, which is, again, an incredible achievement, in Mexico City, Silvio Rodriguez sang an outdoor concert at Zócalo for 100,000 people. So that gives you an idea of how popular and how influential these Cuban singer-songwriters of the Nueva Trova movement are. The group at the Film Institute started each person to go on their way and have their own careers and things around 78, 79. I started a band a few years later because I did spend about a year traveling around and helping my mother with her career. She was performing all over the world, but having a real hard time in the United States because of censorship and the little support. She had, been basically censored by the big festivals and record companies and TV. I mean, she used to have her own TV show in San Francisco before going to Cuba. After going to Cuba, then she wasn't on any major festivals, no record companies. So she had to make her own record company, do her own stuff. And there's an amazing film called The 9 Lives of Barbara Dane to tell you the whole story about that. But around those, the early 80s, I decided to spend some time helping her, in organizing musical accompaniment where possible, whether it was a budget for it or just sometimes playing as a duet. And we made an album together. We were doing a lot of that. But then I decided, I'm going to organize my own band. And my own band, which actually the official birth is 85, but we actually started a couple of years before that. And but it's called Mezcla, which means mixture. And in the early 90s, around 93, there was a concert held in the Revolutionary Square of Havana, Plaza de la Revolución, where 500,000 people came to hear 10 bands, and we were one of the 10 bands. And when we came on stage, I'm talking about everybody in the audience knew the lyrics and were dancing and singing along with us. And if you do the math, 500,000 people in a city of 2 million is like 25% of the population. And again, with no beer company, no cigarette company, no promotion of it, just feeling that this was your music. And the other rule would be that you couldn't bring anybody from the East Coast to the West Coast or the West Coast to the East Coast because they didn't have any money to bring anybody from around the island. This is talking about 10 bands from Havana. So to see the identification that, especially young people felt with the music that we make in Cuba is something amazing. Our music in the United States, for example, our music from Cuba is practically, I would say, like 80% censored. It's like the United States makes it really difficult for an artist from Cuba to get a visa to get into the United States. In 2017, they closed down the possibility to get any non-immigrant visa to get into the United States from Cuba. So an artist has to go to a different country, apply for the visa, and then wait around. So it's like if you got a band, you have to pay for plane tickets, per diems, hotels, everything, to wait around to see if maybe you'll get the visa. And it's hard to get the gigs, lined up until you get the visa, and you can't get the visa until you get the gigs lined up. So it makes it really hard. There's Cuban musicians that have passports with different nationalities or live in different countries. And, so you see a steady flow of Cuban artists, but they're not coming directly from Havana as they have in other times. For example, during the Obama years, I traveled here with my band. A couple of times we did festivals and, venues all over the country. And people just love our music here. But right now, it's just practically impossible for a band from Cuba to get a visa to get into the United States. So this comes together with being 99%, not played on the radio, not played on by more and more monopolized radio, in the United States and TV, just forget it. Yet in Cuba, TV is in the hands of the people. It's nationalized. So I can edit a home video of a concert that we've done in a Cuban theater and have it played for 11 million people, no problem. And they play it 6-7 times. You do have, there's YouTube or something. If you go on YouTube right now and say, Pablo Menéndez and Mezcla, and I'm sure you'll be able to find some very interesting videos of a band that may sound different than anything you ever heard before.
Just talk a little bit more about Mezcla.
The main thing of this band, I always wanted to be kind of part of what was going on, interesting, exciting music from around the world, but based on Afro-Cuban roots. Because like I say, I think one of the biggest inspirations for musicians and people just in general in the world is that as bad as you see the world is, all the wars and all the, just evil things happening around the world, people being divided and hating and, fighting each other and the economy being in such bad shape. You have to think about, okay, is our plight and our situation worse than, for example, walking down the street or the path in the jungle and being hit over the head and thrown naked into a ship and taken to the other end of the world to forced to work as a slave for the rest of your life and never see your family or your homeland again? So the agenda of the slave buyers and slave owners of the world in the Americas was to erase the humanity of the slaves, right? So you couldn't bring any luggage. You were forced to not speak your language, to not play your music, to not adore your, religion. And 500 years later, to see that you could not imagine life on this planet without rock and roll and jazz and blues and salsa and rumba and samba and son and trova and all of these things that are, the music of the resistance struggle, the survival struggle of the African diaspora, then it's not about are your ancestors from Africa or not? It's about, are your ancestors human beings? Human race is born in Africa anyway, so it's like it's all, a question of somebody with vested interest trying to tell us that we're different, but all the people of the human race are all part of the human race. So that's kind of like on the deep end, what you would call mezcla, meaning mixture. Or you could say on a more superficial level, mixture of European and African music, or the mixture of Cuban music and American U.S. music, or mixture of jazz and trova and rock and roll and rumba, and, whatever, just mixing all these things together, because that's the way human beings really are. Because I've always had the what do you call it? A professional bad habit of, like when I visit somebody's house for the first time, I go over and when they're getting some water for me or something in the kitchen, then I go and look at their record collection. And I've always seen that people have records and they have them divided in different genres, And, when we started to go to Spain with, the whole Nueva Trova thing and, the Grupo de Experimentación, Sonora, ICAIC, which again, we were playing rock jazz, Cuban rock jazz, instrumental music together with the new song, political songs, love songs, everything. But I would go to people's houses and they would have, Weather Report and Chick Corea over here, and then, the political song records on the other side of the cabinet. And we were doing all that stuff in the same band. So Mezcla is actually just kind of an extension of that. But I also thought that it was important because of, something I learned from my mother, Barbara Dane, is that the most democratic model of society in the world is a musical band, playing stuff like jazz, because everybody gets their chance to shine. And I tried to have members of the band that are exciting soloists and have something to contribute in their own way, but then we all support each other collectively, and then each of us have their own moment to sing the lead or to play solos, and so that's basically what it's all about. When we started making records, we had this German record company was trying to promote us in Europe, and they were trying to do us as world music. That had some contradictions in it because they after about 4 or 5 years of trying to promote world music, they were saying, well, none of these world music stars have ever sold more than 20, 30,000 records, and we're talking about pop music selling millions of records, so yeah, let's just trash this whole thing. And German companies, approaching, record buyers in England for their records stores. Talking back in the time when they used to have these round things called records, like CDs and things. And they would say, well, no, we don't want world music. So they say, no, this is actually jazz. Oh, let's play. And, it was a total flop on the jazz thing because there was Cuban jazz musicians, in fact, that were just, tearing up the world with, more purely jazz stuff and something that was so mixed like what we were doing. They just don't have any way of marketing it. If you hear the band live, a concert, and you get it that all of the stuff that we're playing is stuff that you're probably going to like a whole lot, and, you see all of the love that is pouring out of each of the musicians on stage and things, and you're going to be really attracted to it. So, like I say, well, we got this venue of YouTube. Go on YouTube and listen to Mezcla, but listen to more stuff than, just the first 30 seconds or something. Because I know people have a short attention span. No, it's just, you have to go a little bit deeper. And you're going to hear, like we're doing some pretty crazy stuff. And probably doesn't fall into any categories. But I know that when we do go to places, it may be a jazz festival in Colombia or islands of the Caribbean, like Martinique or Dominican Republic. We've played in Europe, especially in Norway and Denmark, and for around 7 years we were traveling all over Europe and all over Germany. In the United States, during the periods when the U.S. was allowing Cuban bands to come in the late 90s and around the end of the first decade, beginning of the second decade, during the Obama years, it was easier to tour in the U.S. People, like I say, they might not know what to expect when they hear us, but when they do, they just love the band. So we have a lot of fun playing for people, and that's what we love to do. And I tell you another thing. Every time you hear an artist that you respect and love doing something that's below their artistic, level or quality, and you think, why are they doing this? This is, not doesn't, honor their legacy and things. So the phrase that they use here in the United States is, well, they got to pay the rent. So interesting fact about Cuba has nothing to do with music. Well, or maybe it does. Is that 90% of the people in Cuba, because of the 3 or 4 different urban reforms, are home owners. We own our homes. So we don't have to do anything to pay the rent. So basically, I think we're freer than most musicians and artists around the world, We have more freedom because we don't have that economic axe hanging over our head. There's this thing also that I don't know, except maybe Scandinavia, someplace, there's very few countries in the world that actually musicians get paid a salary. And so it's... it's that this is the subversive stuff about why the U.S. doesn't want you to go to Cuba. And actually, I have to remind people that it's easier to go than ever because you can get your visa at the airport and get on the plane. And all you have to do for Homeland Security is they have 12 categories. So you just put a little X in the category of in support of the Cuban people and get on the plane and no questions asked. You just go and come and do whatever you want in Cuba because you're going to be received with open arms, especially if you're a music lover. You just go down there, as long as you're not trying to tell people in Cuba what to do or anything like that, and then people are going to love you in Cuba. This thing about having a salary, if you meet a Cuban musician, they will have studied English at school, and they'll speak enough English to have a very basic conversation maybe. You ask them about, you're a musician. What is your day job? They won't understand the question. Say, my job, I'm a musician. No, what is your day job? Oh, my job, I'm a musician. And that's all, So like, okay, don't have to pay no rent. Get a salary. You can do whatever music you want, with total freedom. The only thing, you have to remember that the United States, the most powerful empire in the world that spends like twice over for the military budget than the rest of the world, spends around $60 million a year on ideological warfare on the internet, just war on Cuba. So in a war zone, of course, you cannot promote the views and objectives of the enemy. And, just think about any war. I mean, people in the United States kind of have this cliche of Nazi Germany in the United States. So in the United States during the Second World War, you couldn't go on TV and promote, Adolf Hitler's speeches. So that's about the only rule there is in Cuba is that, okay, don't come and say, oh, we want regime change in Cuba. That's illegal, as it logically should be. Anything else is totally free. You say whatever you want. And you know, it is a country where whatever they say about it, think about the fact that after 60-something years of the United States doing every possible trick in their bag, except for direct military invasion or atom bombs to topple the government, and they haven't been able to do it. So that must mean, you know, since they're so successful everywhere else they try that the majority of the Cuban people still support the revolution, whatever is happening, even with all of the economic difficulties brought on by the economic war the United States is waging against the Cuban people. It's an amazing situation where we musicians, I think, you know, I have the distinct impression that we have a richer cultural life, especially because the ticket prices are subsidized, so that's practically free to go and see. Every week, every day, there's some sort of a festival, concert, amazing artists, not only Cuban, but also from around the world coming to Cuba to perform, things like that. So we have a rich cultural life in Cuba that you would not believe. So come to Cuba and see it for yourself, you know. Don't take the word of anybody else telling you about Cuba. Come to Cuba and see us, and come to a Mezcla concert. Say hello and say that you heard Catherine Murphy's podcast.